For me, the main case against Erdoğan, the incontrovertible argument for his maliciousness is Syria.
To understand geopolitics, you must have the freedom to be honest. The More Freedom Foundation podcast. How are you, Rob?
Not bad, no complaints.
We've reached an important milestone.
Oh yeah, what's that?
I have given my second blood donation whilst we've been recording this podcast, so that's how long we've been at it.
Oh wow, you donate blood often?
I think 3 times a year, but I just wanted to bring it up to point out some positive aspects of it, which are basically you get a wee mini health check, and it also lowers your blood pressure.
I did not know that.
So those are some benefits.
I did not know that.
Is there anything that might raise Turkey's blood pressure that you're aware of?
Well, yes. There's that's an artful segue there, Rory. Artful. So this is part 2 of our discussion of the Turkish election, and I would like in this episode to salvage what's left of my Turkish audience after publishing something called The Case for Erdoğan. This is the case against Recep Tayyip Erdoğan. And I think
Erdoğan, Turkey's Lincoln, I think it was referred to as at some points.
I think that, wow, yeah, man, geez. You're not helping me here, Rory.
This could be why he's not Turkey's Lincoln.
Well, no, I mean, Turkey's Lincoln. Let's go with Turkey's FDR. Turkey is FDR. Let's go with that. That's a little more, because FDR is still a controversial figure and always will be. I don't think Erdogan's going to make it to Lincoln levels of sainthood, secular-ish sainthood. Though I was just at Lincoln's tomb yesterday, and that goes far beyond the secular, I would say. But yeah, Recep Tayyip Erdoğan is a guy who I've been living with for, my first summer internship in Turkey was in 2010. So the 13 years I've been watching Erdoğan work his way through Turkish politics and sort of evolving visions of him. And I think in 2010, I was a pretty, staunch Erdoğan supporter would overdo it. But I was in environments that were already pretty anti-Erdoğan. This is Western environments, generally. Unfortunately, most of the Turks that fortunately and unfortunately, some of my best friends, but most of the Turks that I hung out with were pretty much old school secular elite types. So he was already widely loathed in 2010. But in 2010, I couldn't really see it. In 2013, I really, really see it. For me, the main case against Erdoğan, the incontrovertible argument for his maliciousness is Syria. Syria has been at the root of Turkey's crisis for the past decade. Syria is the reason that things have gotten as crazy as they have in Turkey. Syria is also the reason that Erdoğan has been able to consolidate power the way that he has. And it's been a tremendous tragedy for Erdoğan. I think that Erdoğan could have retired, if in a world without Syria, he could have made it to 2015, 2016, retired as a widely celebrated figure in Turkey and abroad, leaving behind a more democratic system that had reconciled a lot of these issues with Islam. He could have done that. But instead, and this was a choice that he made, decided to get involved in Syria, and it has had all of the chaotic reactions that have ensued, from the reigniting of the Kurdish war, from the coup itself. I find it very hard to believe that the coup would have happened without this military that had been so involved in Syria. It's interesting, we talked last time about how the military had largely been decapitated and debilitated, but this activity in Syria had also created a new sense of possibilities and activity for that military.
A new generation?
A new generation of folks that might have even had wider horizons than the old secular elite that was mostly interested in controlling Turkey. So it's just been an incredible disaster. And it's been a disaster in ways that Erdoğan and his supporters acknowledge and make a big deal about. And they're not wrong. They're not wrong that Turkey has been forced to deal with a refugee crisis on a scale well beyond anything that Europe has had to deal with. Europe famously lost its mind in 2015, 2016, over about 1 million refugees. Turkey has put up 4 million for most of a decade now, and has actually, during much of that period of time, has been quite virtuous and even heroic in how welcoming they have been to those Syrian refugees. It is now a pretty nasty part of Turkish politics, the way that the Syrian refugees are talked about and referred to. But a lot of those folks got Turkish passports. Like a lot of they tremendously welcoming for a long period of time until the Turkish economy started falling apart, sort of 2016, 17, 18, or thereabouts. They're absolutely right that the United States has betrayed Turkey in an incredible way with this relationship with the Kurds. It's not just that the PKK is deeply affiliated with the Rojava, the Syrian Kurds. It's also that the war in Syria spilled over into Turkey. It was just reviewing this recently. I'm actually getting a slightly different perspective on the Turkish intervention in Syria when you consider this launched in 2016, is expanded most recently in 2019. I'm seeing that in a different light now that I've reviewed the history recently and looked at the fact that in 2015, 2016, there was open war between the Syrian Kurds and Turkey in Turkey before it was in Syria. So that kind of stuff looks kind of justified. But all of this at its very root was launched by Erdoğan's incredibly stupid, incredibly selfish, incredibly wrong decision to get involved in Syria in the first place. The Turkish Republic, with the exception of Cyprus, which is a whole nother can of worms, in the 1970s, Turkish and Greek, to put this in as neutral terms as I possibly can, Turkish and Greek inhabitants of Cyprus, an island in the Mediterranean, had a massive falling out. The Greeks were winning, so the Turkish military intervened to protect Turks there, and intervened in ways that can be characterized as horrible or malicious or heroic or what have you. That's not what I want to get into today. But with the exception of that intervention to protect Turks, the Turkish Republic, for a full century, despite having a very strong military emphasis, was non-interventionist in a very real way. Like they just were not interested in going out and trying to conquer places. I think the ruinous legacy of the Ottoman Empire, where for the past 80 years, they'd be like, oh gosh, we have to go defend this chunk. And then another chunk would get invaded. Oh, we have to defend this chunk. And just, it ended up in incredible catastrophe for the Ottoman Empire. So Turkey just didn't do a lot of this intervention in its neighbors. And then in 2011, I think largely because the United States asked him to, the Erdoğan committed the Turkish government to overthrowing the government next door and acted in really malicious, really horrific ways.
So it's all Obama's fault?
Well, I would say the main actor who should be blamed for murdering 500,000 people in Syria, it goes back and forth for me whether it's Erdoğan or whether it's Obama. I think sure, Obama was pushed by, and I think that's actually it's an interesting contrast. I think Obama takes the blame. Obama absolutely deserves the blame for the death of 500,000 Syrians. But he was kind of pushed by his system in a lot of ways. Whether you want to talk about the Israel lobby, whether you want to talk about defense contractors, whether you want to talk about just Hillary Clinton and her thirst for blood.
Don't quite a few American presidents talk peace, and then once they're in the White House, suddenly that changes?
Absolutely. That's a very established dynamic because of just the way that the incentives work, the way that everybody in the U.S. government is bought and paid for by defense interests. The contrast here, though, is that Obama, deserves this blame, but you can make excuses for him because of the way that the U.S. system works. Maybe he was forced into this to some degree. You can't really make that argument for Erdoğan. Erdoğan had a lot of, battled his system, in part because he saw political advantage in it, but he fought hard to overinvest Turkey in creating this war. And Obama would not have been able to kill 500,000 Syrians if it were not for Turkey's participation. Yes, Assad is a bad man. I feel like I need to say this. Assad is a very bad man. He's a terrible, terrible dictator. But what he was doing in 2011 was no worse than what the Egyptian dictator Sisi did in 2013 that we've supported eagerly for the past decade, was no worse than what Saudi Arabia did in Bahrain. We took a guy who was a standard Middle Eastern crappy dictator and turned him into an epic mass murderer. And those were choices that Obama and Erdoğan made. And Obama and Erdoğan had infinitely more choice in this situation than Assad did. So yeah, he's a murderous bastard.
Has Erdoğan gone beyond what America would have wanted?
Well, that's a very important question. And I think that most U.S. media and most U.S. government would say, yeah, he supported ISIS. He created the jihadi highway. He basically opened up anybody from anywhere in the world who wanted to fly to Turkey, go down to the border with Syria and go fight Assad was allowed to. And there's this really, really strong emphasis in Washington, D.C., especially as Erdoğan has fallen further and further out of favor with Washington, D.C. since 2013. Surprising number of people in Washington, D.C. would probably agree with me now, not in blaming Obama for the Syrian war, but blaming Turkey for the Syrian war. Of course, Washington, D.C. will always, it's Assad, it's butcher Assad, it's butcher Assad. But it's Erdogan's fault that it became such a jihadist nightmare because he let people come in and the foreign fighters and this, that, and the other thing. I think that is BS. I think that the United States has always been tremendously supportive of the nasty jihadist elements, even after the Islamic State. We worked really hard and funded and tried to support nasty jihadist elements that weren't the Islamic State. Like if you'll just, change the badge on your uniform or whatever, if you'll just pretend to not be Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State, we'll continue supporting you, you nasty jihadists, all the way up until, this is something that I hate giving Trump credit for things, but in 2017, he stopped. So basically, we were supporting nasty jihadists in Syria throughout the first 3 years of our fight against the Islamic State, as long as they were not directly affiliated with Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State. There are no jihadists left. And it's interesting that after our funding stopped in 2017, very quickly, all non-Al-Qaeda jihadists disappeared. There just wasn't, or rather they just joined up with Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. Like there was never much to the Syrian rebellion that wasn't nasty jihadists. And it was in the interests of nasty jihadists that we were supporting to pretend to not be working with the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda. But they really kind of were, even if they were fighting against each other. This is a dynamic that goes, it is very similar in the Afghan war. We supported many, many different elements that were all against the Soviets and that often fought against each other, even when they were fighting the Soviets, but certainly thereafter. We supported a whole bunch of elements in the Syrian war that were mostly jihadist, that were fighting against the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, but they were mostly fighting against Assad. So I think and we do this with Pakistan as well, where we're like, it was Pakistan that made the fight against the Soviets so nasty. where it's like, no, like, I mean, you just chose to support elements against somebody you didn't like. And when it's the Soviet Union, I think that's a lot more defensible. The Soviet Union was a serious rival for the United States in the 1980s, and you had mutually assured destruction. You can go back and forth whether or not I think the Soviet Union probably would have fallen without the war in Afghanistan, but who can say that? That was actually a worthwhile thing to do. And we ended up getting 9/11 because of those actions that we had taken. And you know what? Maybe it was worth it. Who knows? It was not worth creating the Islamic State to overthrow Assad, but that is definitely something we did. Turkey was a very vital part of that, and Turkey has suffered. The United States has not, and hopefully never will, suffer the sort of 9/11 scale consequences that we suffered from supporting jihadists in Afghanistan, but Turkey has suffered those consequences. And again, that is Erdogan's choice. It was Erdogan's choice to turn on Assad in the 2000s under the zero problems with neighbors policy, which was a great policy that the AK party, that Erdogan's government participated in. He was very friendly with Assad. He was going on vacations with the Assad family. He was, he had established a level of positive relations with Syria that it had not had over the entire period of the Assad regime, the current Assad's father, which was a great thing. There was talk, I need to back this up more. I need to go back and research the details. But my understanding was that in part because the EU had been denying Turkey's application for so long, they were actually creating a free trade area between Turkey and sort of the Levant more generally, Lebanon, Syria, like just incredible positive potential here. But in part because for domestic political reasons, Erdogan felt that he wanted to get the U.S. more on side, he teamed up with the Obama administration and created the Syrian civil war. And the consequences have been horrific. But I think that's the center of the case against Erdogan is...
If Erdogan loses, can you see Turkey leaving the territories they control in Syria?
That's a really, really, really important question. And I would say no, for starters. I think that I think there's certainly elements of the Turkish opposition that have campaigned really hard against that and really want a negotiation with Assad. That Erdogan has, there's been rumors of Erdogan-Assad contact, but that's just really difficult to do. He's spent a decade talking about how he's a terrible murderer and has actually invaded his country. So much like Obama campaigned on closing down Guantanamo, on abandoning a lot of aspects of George W. Bush's war on terror, but in actual practice, what he did was he sort of formalized and humanized. You can't see the air quotes I'm doing there. He sort of made it look a little more palatable. He's like, oh no, we've got teams of lawyers that are looking into the people we murder extrajudicially. It's much nicer. And I think that the chances are that no matter what the commitments they're making on the campaign trail, that the Turkish opposition in power is going to have a lot of trouble just withdrawing from Syria. I'd love to see that. That sounds great. And I think that some aspects of the Turkish opposition have promised that, but seeing that happen, seeing that come to fruition is a lot more complicated.
I feel an elephant in the room we didn't touch on in the last episode is Erdogan's response to the earthquake.
Yes, this is huge.
Because he was ahead in the polls, or it was much more neck and neck, and after the earthquake, he's losing by a wider margin. Yeah,
I think, and there's some recent polls that indicate that he might be neck and neck again, but who knows, what these polls really indicate.
I think Turkish polls are known to be not the most accurate.
So I think the consensus from 2019, I believe it was 2019, I really should have looked that up, but I think it's 2019, those local elections that he lost, from 2019 into 2022, so 2019, 2020, 2021, as the Turkish economy fell just further and further into disaster, hyperinflation.
He doesn't like the interest rate lobby.
Yes. It's fallen more and more. I think the growing consensus was, wow, I think Erdogan's actually going to lose these 2023 elections. And then Ukraine happened. And all of a sudden, this Turkish Erdogan, who had burned all of his bridges, in part over Syria, burned all of his bridges with Europe and the United States, was becoming this very isolated figure with a basket case economy. All of a sudden, to fight Ukraine, he's really, really essential. And all of a sudden, you've got everybody wants to talk to him again. Everybody wants to talk about concessions to him again. Everybody wants to talk about...
And there's Ukrainian folk songs about Turkish hardware.
There you go. Yes, of course, the Bayraktar, that sort of thing. He's got the chokehold on the Black Sea. All of a sudden, he becomes a much more important figure. The financial taps open, the Gulf money. I'm sure, Gulf countries make their own decisions about where they send money, but if Blinken calling them up and being like, hey, we really wouldn't mind if you deposited like $5 billion in the Turkish treasury. All of that worked really well for him. And I was just like, God damn it. Like, this fight against Ukraine, this fight against Russia, and another bit of collateral damage will be Erdogan winning another election. And then the earthquake happened. As we talked about last time, a really huge part of the case for Erdogan is the contrast with the horrific 1990s and just the failure.
How Turkey was before him.
The economic failure of the 1990s, the Kurdish issue failure of the 1990s. And in 1999, there was an incredibly horrific Turkish earthquake that the elites of the time, the parties in power at the time, were seen as completely botching, completely mismanaging, completely horrifically handling. And that was 99, and I guess they didn't lose the election until 2002, but that was a key part of the just the chaos, the nightmare of the long 1990s. Well, Erdogan now has economic crisis, Kurdish issues that are looking as bad as they ever have, and this horrific earthquake. The 1999 earthquake killed 20,000 people. This earthquake is now reckoned to have killed most of 60,000 people.
Displaced 1 million people.
Extraordinary. It's such a horrific tragedy. In the 1990s, the folks in power during that earthquake could at least make the case, well, no, it was the other guy. It was the other guy in the coalition. It was the other guy who was in power before me. Or, the military just had a coup. How can we be expected to be on top of building codes or what have you? Erdogan and the AK Party have been in unbroken control for 20 years before February 6th. So there is nobody else to blame for these skyscrapers that were built during their time in power that were toppling over.
But also, apparently, to encourage economic growth, there was a blind eye turned to a lot of the earthquake provisions that were meant to be implemented on buildings.
Exactly.
So a lot of things didn't get the correct structures they should have. This is where a lot of these deaths have been, which is sort of can be directly tied to Erdogan.
Exactly. And this was a policy that was seen as, it certainly was described to me as a positive one while I was living there. He would formalize title. He was creating landowners. 50 years ago, Istanbul was 500,000 people. Now it's almost 20 million people. And a lot of this was done very quickly and very informally in the 1980s and 1990s, in part actually because a lot of villages were being cleared out by the war between the Turkish state and the Kurds. And these folks would arrive in Istanbul, arrive in Ankara, and they called them gece condos, night condos, because they were just erected in an evening and illegally. And one of these great things that the AK Party was celebrated for doing was formalizing title to these structures, being like, oh, well, it's obviously a mess, but you can own it, and you can get equity out of it, and you can invest in it, and you can make it better. But obviously, we're seeing some downsides to that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So there's no blame it on the other guy. There's no, the military. And
also, when you've been in power for 20 years, it's hard to blame it on anyone else.
And I think that has really, And, it's interesting, obviously, it's, I'm thinking Turkey has nothing to do with China, but it's just the mandate of heaven concept, and I think that's this idea that the supernatural forces will give and withdraw an endorsement of a certain government. And you see this in the United States context as well. People like to talk about the financial crisis and the Iraq War as Bush-era calamities, but Katrina is number 3, if it's not number 2, when people will talk about them. That is just sort of natural disasters, sort of just highlighting how inadequate the government is. And that's, just to see this, there's almost a dark poetry to it, to see this AK Party's complete transformation into a 1990s basket case. Not only is the economy gone, the Kurds are gone, but also they've got a even more horrifically mismanaged earthquake. It does sort of seem like the mandate of heaven is being withdrawn from Erdoğan, and it's hard to argue that his success is ordained by God, as is certainly heavily implied, at least by some in Turkish politics, if you've got this earthquake 3 months before. And I think they had just announced moving up the Turkish elections to May 14th, and within a month or 2 months of that announcement, you've got this catastrophic, horrific earthquake. It's pretty grim. And there's also just Erdoğan's personality, and this is part of his genius. This is part of why he's been so appealing, why he's been able to win so many elections, is that his sort of strongman approach. Repeatedly read about how his usage of the Turkish language, his style of rhetoric is just really appealing to a really broad swath of the Turkish public. But that rhetoric, that way he approaches the world, has real negative implications. I think he got a lot of power in the Arab world, or used to, and a lot of respect, because he would call out Israel in ways that were very popular in just the Muslim world in general. And that's one thing, but the way that he speaks about the U.S. government, the way that he speaks about Germany, I think he's multiple times compared Germans to Nazis, and they don't really like that.
No.
Yeah, they're not big fans of that.
Well, try flying a swastika in Germany and see what happens. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, the Turks and the Germans have really, really close relations because of sort of 70 years of guest worker relationships, and it's just his incredible viciousness of rhetoric and intemperateness. That kind of behavior can be electorally successful in a lot of countries. Look at Donald Trump. But it also has very, very real consequences. I think that the Turkish government has some really real grievances around the U.S. relationship with the PKK, with the Kurds in Syria. I think those are really rational.
The HDP?
No, the HDP is a very different. The AK Party would argue that the HDP and the PKK are the same, but that would not be the way that others would look at that. So the HDP is a Kurdish party, but I do not believe they do not support violence. I think they inadequately condemned violence in the view of a lot of people, not just in the AK Party in 2015. But I don't. The direct connections between the HDP and the PKK are not established.
Was Erdoğan important in their acceptance within traditional politics in Turkey?
Absolutely. Erdoğan, in the first decade of this century, was a huge part of welcoming Kurds into the political system. And that was always in the context of both support for the AK Party and greater acceptance of Kurdish-specific parties. I think what happened in 2015 that turned Erdoğan against the HDP specifically, and the HDP was at least the second or maybe even the third peaceful Kurdish-oriented political party just in Erdogan's time. So the HDP, I think, was a little more left, it's interesting, like not more like hard left oriented, but like more like sort of like secular, socially left oriented. And the HDP got a lot of support, not just Kurds, but also sort of old secular, Western focused folks who were becoming very disillusioned with the AK Party that they had previously supported. So the HDP, what the HDP did was it became too successful in 2015, and it got over, this is getting rather technical, but it leaped over a percentage that allowed it to get seats in the Turkish parliament, and that ended the AK Party's majority. But up until 2015, yes, I do believe Erdogan was fairly welcoming to Kurdish parties. And that was sort of part of the sort of the opening. But anyway, so I think that Turkey has a really good case, even though, Turkey got involved in Syria, helped kill this 500,000 people because the United States asked them to. And then the United States repaid Turkey by teaming up with one of the factions that was empowered by this civil war that was fighting the Turkish military at that time in Turkey. So that's an incredible betrayal. But if you express that betrayal, if you complain about the betrayal the way that Erdogan did, you're not going to make any friends. You can't express yourself with the vehemence and brutality that Erdogan does about the United States if you expect the United States to listen to your very, very valid argument that the United States has done a very bad thing. And I think that is one thing that will change very rapidly. When I think that's sort of a more interesting aspect of the Syrian conflict is not that like the Turkish position is going to change. It's just that a rational, friendly voice will be saying the exact same things that Erdogan has said about U.S. betrayal of the United States. And I think that the United States, if it wants this coalition government to last longer, coalition government that briefly replaced Netanyahu and Israel, we're going to have to be very sympathetic.
Well, because we do have very conservative and also then socialist parties all trying to work together. Is it the Good Party is very conservative?
So the Good Party is nationalist. They are like offshoots of the E Party. But I just I think it's a really interesting question, like that actually, yes, like the opposition victory does make a withdrawal from Syria much more likely, but it's not a Turkish withdrawal. It's a U.S. withdrawal. Because I think the very clear good arguments that Turkey has that we have betrayed them and we should not have done that will be a lot harder to ignore from this secular opposition than it was from Turkey. So I think that's and I think the Kurds already see the writing on the wall in Syria. They're getting close to Assad again, or trying to make deals with Assad. That's recent news. Because, it's going to be a lot harder to sustain this illegal U.S. presence in Syria, troop presence of around 1,000 troops. It's going to be a lot harder to sustain that when it's our NATO allies that have elected a nominally much more friendly to the U.S. government who are telling us that this troop presence is unacceptable. So,
could you tell us more about the man that could be replacing Erdogan?
Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, it's interesting in part.
He's nearly been in politics as long as him.
Oh, well, I think they're the same age, more or less, right? I think they're just about 70, both of them. And part of the reason why Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu has stayed out of jail for the past 10 years is that he's seen as quite ineffectual. He's just seen as sort of Turkey famously loves a strongman. And he's an academic, is my understanding. It was sort of his career before politics. And he's famous. He did a justice march. He walked across the country, this, that, and the other thing. And I think he's been good as an opposition figure that outsiders can love. But I don't think he inspires much love or interest in Turkey.
Because even in the polls, he's a bit, if it's just the two men, he's pretty neck and neck with Erdogan. When the other two candidates, the mayor of Ankara and the mayor of Istanbul, are both well ahead in when it's just 2-on-2. So it's sort of seen kind of why have they chosen him.
When the Table of Six announced that Kılıçdaroğlu was going to be their candidate, the E Party, which is a really important component of the Table of Six, the sort of nationalist element, Meral Akşener, I think over a 24-hour period said, screw this, we're not backing him, he's the worst. And then came back and was like, fine, I guess we'll back him because of backdoor negotiations we don't know about. But yeah, those two mayors, Ekrem İmamoğlu, and I think is the Ankara guy's name, Yavaş, they much more attractive candidates, would definitely be much more successful. I think the thing is probably neither of them wanted it because it's so clear and it is so obvious that this government is going to have an incredibly difficult time. There's no question. Like, I don't think it'll be a 1990s level catastrophe because the military is no longer there to be as nightmarish. I do think that there's a potential, especially with Kılıçdaroğlu, that there wouldn't be with Meral Akşener. There is a real possibility not for a full-on Kurdish opening or negotiations with the PKK, but there is a possibility for lowering the tensions.
But what could go wrong with the memorandum of understanding and common policies?
Yeah, right. Yeah. It's just, yeah, sure. So I think this coalition is not as destined to be 1990s style disastrous as a lot of people are assuming, but I do think it's indisputable that it's going to have a terrible time. And I think both Ekrem İmamoğlu and the Ankara guy are sort of being like, you know what, I can let this be a disaster for 2 years and we can hang it on Kılıçdaroğlu, and then I can pitch myself as the savior. In whether it's in 2 years' time or if it's in 8 years' time, I think they're both fairly young, 8 years' time after some kind of AK Party renewal or this, that, and the other thing. So it's just, yeah, I just don't think they probably didn't want to be in charge of that. And I think they're now established as vice presidents, but what does that even mean?
Yes, they're like double vice presidents.
Yeah, like, which is, I don't think really helps in the polls much because people are like, what the hell does that even mean? The Turkish system has dramatically shifted in so many ways over the past 20 years. You've got at the level of constitutions, at the level that, but you've also just got like the details of what does it mean when you've got a figure like Erdoğan sort of calling the shots. Like, it's entirely possible that Kılıçdaroğlu becomes the president, and then either in a formal way or in an informal way, whoever is established as the prime minister ends up being a more powerful figure, even though constitutionally it's supposed to be the president. He's like, a lot of things are really, really up in the air. My understanding is that I think on the same day, we've got presidential elections, but then also parliamentary elections, which will determine, who the prime minister is going to be. Just by nature of the characters and political mandates of Erdoğan versus Kılıçdaroğlu, the parliament is going to be more powerful than it has been, even though the system has changed. The question is going to be how much more.
Why has Erdoğan been so reluctant to increase interest rates?
That gets into aspects that I don't fully understand, and I don't think anybody really fully understands.
Because the basics seem to be if you increase that, it'll reduce inflation. And he's sort of given a textbook example of why you should increase interest rates.
Yeah.
Because it's gone fairly, it was, fairly maybe high for Western countries, but it was fairly flat at around maybe 5 to 20%. And since October in 2021, it shot up past 80%.
Yeah.
It's just outstanding.
He has finally brought Turkish inflation measures back up to the level of the 1990s. I mean, famously, one of the early reforms he did was a currency reform to take 6 zeros off of the Turkish currency. Still, when I handed people like 1 lira for I can't hand people 1 lira for anything in Turkey anymore, but you could when I was living there from 2011, 2016, and they'd say, oh, 1 million, and it was like, oh, he won, because that's what it was. And yeah, it's amazing. I did a sort of somewhat scurrilous short saying that Erdoğan is just Tansu Çiller right now. There's Tansu Çiller's Turkey's first female prime minister, who unfortunately ended up in, I think she had her own very serious faults, but also was just dealing with the horrific situation of Turkey in the 1990s and was remembered very poorly. But Erdogan's current legacy is basically just Tansu Çiller level. I am less, I just don't know about interest rate stuff. I just don't fully understand it. I don't quite get it. And I am generally a little more leery of economic orthodoxy than most other folks are.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's pretty clear that his interest rate policy has been a disaster. And I think that's rooted in, to some degree, I think that's rooted in religious practice, not just, Islamic, but Christian is also just sort of against usury or what have you. So I don't really know what's going on.
So they need a few Lutherans to bring back control of the banks.
That's right. It's some good Protestants who don't care about, famously don't care about the Bible. That's sarcasm, kind of. Yeah, the finance stuff is, what is incontrovertible is that the financial management of Turkey looked incredibly good in the 2000s and has looked incredibly bad in the 2010s and the 2010s, especially in the past 5 years. And it's right back. I mean, it's not right back. It was a middle to low income country in the 1990s, and now it is a middle to upper income country. And that has not been completely lost, but he has pissed away a lot more of that economic momentum than anybody thought was possible.
Can you see him giving up power easily?
Well, no. I mean, we've seen over and over again just how in 2015, when he lost that parliamentary election, in 2019, when he lost the local elections, and doing sort of everything in his power to rerun the elections or make changes that make the elections less relevant or what have you. I think there's a consensus, though, that it would be a lot more difficult and he would have to take much more firmly anti-democratic actions than he has had to this point. And that's a really open question. I don't call Erdogan a dictator. I don't call him a sultan or what have you, because I do believe he has won a lot of elections that have put him there. If he were to lose this election by 10% and then stay in power, then dictator is the only word that can be applied to him. And I think that it's not just a question of can he get away with it. It's also a question of will he and the people around him be willing to do the things that would be necessary to keep him in power? Would they be willing to discard all vestiges of democracy? Would they be willing to truly kill the democratic system that in part he created? And that's a really open question. That is we will find out about over the next couple of weeks, quite possibly. Or maybe he'll just pull it out and win this election outright on May 14th. But I don't think that's anybody's expectation.
If he's voted out, what do you see him doing? Will he retire, or, because he still has a large control over media and a hell of a lot of Turkish life?
So there's a distinction between what Erdogan and his family are going to be able to do and what the, hundreds or thousands of people who have been around him and profited off of him will be able to do. I've heard sort of scuttlebutt, friend of friend of friend of friend, that some of those people are already preemptively fleeing the country. Erdogan and his family, I believe, are largely untouchable and should remain untouchable. This coalition government is going to have enough difficulties without trying to prosecute Erdogan. And I think that, honestly, I think he's not a healthy man. I think that even he and even his children...
69, I think.
He's young, but over the past couple weeks, this is incredibly important time. He's been unable to campaign on certain days because his health.
And there was a television debate he was late for because he had a coughing fit or something, he said.
So his health is not so great. But
it's also terrible timing for him.
Yeah, I think it's entirely possible that he'll do some kind of deal with the opposition just sort of, that's a possibility, just sort of like leave me and my kids alone and, my irritating son-in-laws as well, and I'll let this happen or something like that. Promise you won't come after my billions or my private islands. And I think that's a deal that the coalition should absolutely make.
Well, it also seems the best for, Turkish peace in the future.
Turkish peace, stability. And you know what? He's his legacy, especially if he does step back, I think his legacy is like Turkey's greatest Democrat is frankly pretty established, George Washington didn't take multi-billion-dollar bribes to step away from power.
And I'm sure Erdoğan knows how to make a deal.
Yes, I think he does. Obviously, even if he doesn't make a deal, I think that the coalition will have bigger fish to fry. Some of those bigger fish they will be frying, however, will be a broad range of Erdogan-affiliated business people who, it's entirely possible that if Erdogan were prosecuted, you could see, like, as we saw during the 2016 Turkish coup, people coming to the streets and like open civil war in Turkey. We could see that. I don't think anybody's going to go to war for Joe.
We won't have a full Pakistan situation.
Joe real estate from Anatolia. I don't think they're gonna really particularly care.
He's no Imran Khan.
Oh well, no, I think he might be some Imran. I think that he has incredible support still from at least a quarter of the Turkish public. So yeah, going after him is a really bad idea. But what I'm trying to say is I don't think that quarter of the Turkish public would particularly care if they went after henchman number 5, or no, henchman number 5 through henchman number 1,000. And what's interesting is a lot of elements of the AK Party from that era when things were going well, from the 2000s, have long since abandoned Erdogan. In the table of 6, you have 2 parties that are led by famous AK Party figures of the 2000s, Ali Babacan and Davutoglu. But 2 of these parties are led by folks who used to be, when the AK Party was a serious party, serious elements of that party. So Erdogan has famously been down to the dregs in terms of the people who are supporting him. And we've just got a lot of really outright corrupt business folks who nobody's really going to care about.
And Erdogan would be happy to throw under a bus.
Yes. Yeah. One thing we've definitely learned is that he does not have a particularly high degree of loyalty to his supporters. I think obviously there's going to have to be some kind of deal between the opposition and Erdogan and his family, and I think that would be the right deal to make for the stability of Turkey. But again, it's entirely possible that he'll just win. He'll win outright on Sunday. We don't know. And it's entirely possible that he will win outright through theft. That they're definitely it was 1% to 2%, in 2015, maybe they can get away with falsifying 5% this time, so I don't know. I just don't know. We shall see.
If he's voted out, could you see him running again whenever the next election is?
Well, it's sort of the Netanyahu possibility. And I think that's a really important, really vital example for the Biden administration, because I think was just a year ago? The timeline on this escapes me, but Netanyahu, after the 8th election in 3 months or something like that, was finally kicked out of power by this incredibly tenuous coalition that was able to hold on for 10 months.
Because there was talk of Netanyahu even going to jail because other Israeli prime ministers have been in jail for their crimes. And here he is back in charge again.
Yep. And I think that's a very real possibility in Turkey. And I think that's why it's really important for the United States to just do everything they possibly can to make this coalition a success. And the United States and Europe as well, have incredible levers that they can pull to do that. I'm afraid that the temptation will be we'll give you some stuff, now give us some stuff, give us the S-400, give us, withdraw from Syria, then maybe we can talk about this. And no, immediately, Europe and the United States have to be really generous. It's an interesting thing. I was reading about that Europe made a formal commitment to Turkey related to the refugee issues to grant visa-free travel to Turks to Europe. And then they backed out of that because, more or less fairly, because Erdoğan was being too authoritarian, and that was their justification. Well, okay, you've got this coalition government. I think on day 2, they should grant visa-free travel to Turks. I think that would be the kind of, we should be throwing carrots at these guys. We should make them look very successful very quickly, no matter how little they give us. Yeah, how little they give us in terms of like our traditional concerns with Turkey, because it's an AK Party restoration is very possible. But Erdoğan has created this this polycrisis that is incredibly difficult, and it's part of his strategy is like, I'm going to create this incredible juggling act of plates and breakable stuff and spiked baseball bats in the air that only I am capable of keeping in the air, and a lot of it will come crashing down pretty immediately. And the U.S. and Europe really need to be there for Turkey if we want to keep the AK Party out of power.
How has Greece fared with this election? Have they been mentioned much? Or considering all the things we've mentioned, they're way down the list?
I take the competition between Greece and Turkey. I find it so unserious. I just don't like it. It's kind of like the competition between India and Pakistan. It's like they were, this was an incredibly important dynamic in the founding decades of both countries. And it's just like, it's not a competition anymore. Like India just won. Turkey just won. And I think it's beneath, frankly, I think it's beneath Turkish politicians continue to act like this is a real rivalry. It's like the U.S. being obsessed with Canada. It's like a vestigial joke. I just don't take it seriously. Unfortunately, I think both Erdoğan's party and the new party will be taking it seriously because it's as all Indian politicians take competition from Pakistan very seriously because it's just fundamental to the political makeup. Will we see real movement on Cyprus? No. Will we see probably marginally less? Well, I think what you might actually see is some real negotiation between the less offensive Turkish government and Greece and Israel and Egypt over the gas, because I think that even now it's looking less likely. There's this idea we're going to do this East Med pipeline and we're going to supply all this gas to Europe. And that certainly looks a lot more viable than it did when Europe had Russia to rely on. But still, even now, even after all that, like Turkey's still the most obvious market for this gas. And the only reason that they were being cut out of it is because Erdoğan was such a dumbass. Expecting quick action on the part of the Turkish government, like, oh, we're going to be friends over Cyprus, and we're going to, go hug the Greek prime minister. No, you should not expect that. But I do think some kind of more positive deal between Turkey and Israel, Egypt, Cyprus, Lebanon over these gas resources is very likely with a more civil Turkish government. And if that happens, then I think a lot of the current impetus between Turkish-Greek problems might not go away entirely, but the pressure will be lessened. And we can move forward towards, Turkey and Greece. As, again, we were kind of getting to in the first decade of Erdoğan, of the old tensions disappearing. But yeah, that's one of the worst things about late stage Erdoğan, really just since 2015, is that he's needed the nationalists to stay in power. So that's meant he's had to just turn into...
Completely flip on early Erdoğan.
Yeah, he has to turn into sort of like a mid-20th century dumbass when it comes to his treatment of the Greek-Turkish relationship.
So what odds are you going to give Erdoğan losing?
Yeah, I'm going to be boring, and I'm just going to go 50-50. I really just don't know. Or maybe 60-40 towards Erdogan winning. Well, there's two separate questions there, right? Like maybe I'm 50-50 on him winning the election, and then I'm like 60-40 on him still being in power next year,
Or alive at this rate with his health.
So I have this sort of theory which actually makes me feel a little bit better about the Biden nomination. I do not feel good about the Biden nomination, to be clear. I desperately like anybody else. The thing about being an old person and an ill person is that purpose keeps you going. That's that. And we see over and over and over again, like very, very few people die in power. You could lots of examples, like Mahathir in Malaysia, a guy who was, found himself in government again in his 90s. Konrad Adenauer in Germany was started governing the place in his 60s and then was in power for another 30 years or something like that after World War II. Like old, sick people in power, if they remain in power, can be preserved by that. So since I moved to Turkey, or my first visit to Turkey in 2009, people were talking about Erdogan's health. Not always, but certainly for 15 years. There's been questions about Erdogan's health and very confident rumors that, he's done. Actually Ataturk did die in power, but he died in power because he'd kind of accomplished everything. He'd
lost his drive. He was too successful.
Yeah, he'd saved his country. He'd battled off the British, and then he'd battled off the Greeks, and he'd established, he massively changed, and all that was required of him was to just sort of go to parties, and he did not survive that.
So it's the parties?
Yes.
Erdogan needs to steer clear of parties.
It's the parties, but I think Erdogan and, Biden, Trump, are still, instilled with this deep sense of purpose, and that'll keep a person alive. That'll keep a person alive. So I one theory that I have heard is that, if he does find himself out of power, he'll quickly decline and die. But that's a possibility.
Or it could give him more drive to get back in power.
Also, maybe he finally gets to sleep, for a month or two and comes back
rejuvenated.
Who knows?
Okay.
Because it's just reading about his. I've been reading like 3 books on Erdogan over the past month or so, and it's just, especially since 2011 when he started falling out with the Gulenists, I can't think of a person on this planet I would less like to be than Erdogan, because he's just gone to sleep every night, wondering, who's going to turn on me tomorrow, or are there? I think it's an entirely rational concern on his part. Are there? Are there assassins coming for me right now? In 2016, there was a gang of, a hit squad that was coming for him, and I think missed him by 10 minutes or something. This is during the coup. So I can't think of a less pleasant, in part, actually, that's if you want to know why he made this horrific decision to kill 500,000 Syrians and drag his country into this war, I think that's probably the falling out with the Gulenists, that you can look at it that way. It's just he needed something that was going to give him leverage with the United States and with Europe, and both. And it's something we forget is that despite all our complaints in more recent years, the U.S. and Europe were all on board with Turkey's early actions to destabilize Assad, contributing to them heavily. Yeah, but I think that's the connection. He started realizing he was losing the Gulenists, and he needed, and the Gulenists do have, as we all know, Fethullah Gulen is living in Pennsylvania. The Gulenists have deep connections to the United States, and to sort of navigate around that, Erdogan did exactly what the Obama administration wanted in Syria, to incredible cost, to millions of people.
Well, I think we've covered all his negative aspects in this episode.
Oh, there are so many more negative aspects to Erdogan. Everybody in power is a sociopath, without question. But yeah, he's a really, really successful sociopath. talking to Turkish people, other folks, like people just don't have faith that Turkey, even people who really oppose Erdoğan, seem to lack faith that Turkey will be able to
cope without him,
move forward without him. You know, they do, and I think there is a good case to be made that all of these spinning plates are just going to fall down and it's going to be disastrous. But like, I think that in part because of Erdogan's contributions towards sort of like solving the democracy problem, getting the military out, sort of defusing the Islamist time bomb, I really do think that Turkey can vote this guy out this Sunday, and no question it'll be a very chaotic 6 months, 2 years or so, but then move forward as a much stronger, much more impressive country. I think that is...
So Erdogan may have planted fertile soil for democracy?
Yeah. Well, and also, like, if we're at this point, and I think there are definitely Turkish business people who are making this calculation, you're like, I hate Erdogan and everything he stands for, but like, I'm so scared by what could come after that I'm just going to vote for him again. But think about like just how exponentially worse Erdogan's governance has gotten, like almost every year. So, okay, fine. So, you just want to keep those plates spinning for another 2 or 3 years.
But he's been dropping a few plates.
So let's vote. Yeah, and he's just going to add plates until he dies, you know?
Well, that would be much worse because there's such a power vacuum.
Yeah. Yeah. So the responsible thing is to get
some sweetheart deals and enjoy retirement.
Yeah. The sensible thing is to get rid of him now, because it's not going to be better 4 or 5 years from now. And while his health things can be overstated, he's not going to be alive 20 years from now. We can't let him have another decade to just make things exponentially worse and worse.
So we'll catch you next time on the More Freedom Foundation podcast. The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire: What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.